This NBA offseason revolved around two players in Jimmy Butler and Paul George, and there started to be an argument about who was better, Jimmy Butler or Paul George, because the Boston Celtics were in the position to acquire both of them, and people were trying to see who was the better player. And although they're eerily similar, they have distinct features that make them unique, and today I will be trying to determine who the better player is. Alright, so I asked this on Hardwood Amino, Reddit, and the Hoop Talk podcast Discord, and the answer was kind of overwhelmingly Paul George. But if you look at the stats, they're closer than what you would think they are, because by the responses I got, you would think that Paul George was just light years ahead of Jimmy Butler, when that is simply not the case. But if you look at the stats, Jimmy Butler played in 76 games compared to Paul George's 75. He averaged 37 minutes a game compared to Paul George's 35.9, so basically 36. 23.9 points compared to Paul George's 23.7. 6.2 rebounds compared to Paul George's 6.6. 1.7 offensive rebounds, which is almost 2 compared to Paul George's 0.8, which is pretty much 1. And then for assists, Jimmy Butler has 5.5, Paul George has 3.2. 1.9 steals and 1.6 for Paul George. 0.4 blocks for Butler and 0.4 for Paul George. 2.1 turnovers to 2.9 for Paul George. 1.5 fouls to 2.7 fouls for Paul George. 7.5 field goals to 8.3 for Paul George. And then for his field goal attempts, Jimmy Butler averages 16.5 and Paul George equals 18. And then for their field goal percentage, Jimmy Butler shoots 45.5, which is basically 46, and Paul George is 46.1. And then for the three-pointers made, Paul George made 2.6 while Jimmy Butler had 1.2. And then for the attempted, Paul George averaged 2 times more three-pointers attempted than Jimmy Butler, and 6.6, and Jimmy Butler averaged 3.3. And then for three-point percentage, Jimmy Butler 36.7% and Paul George 39.3%. And then for their free throws made, Jimmy Butler was 7.7 compared to Paul George's 4.5. So it was basically 8 compared to 5. And then for free throw attempts, Jimmy Butler 8.9, which is basically 9 compared to Paul George's 5. And then for the free throw percentage, Jimmy Butler shot 86.5% compared to Paul George's 89.8%. Alright, so just looking at the stats, it appears that Paul George is more efficient due to having a higher field goal percentage and 3-point percentage on 2 times more threes than Jimmy Butler, and he has a higher free throw percentage. And Jimmy is better at getting assists, offensive boards, less turnovers, and getting to the free throw line. Everything else is really too close to really say who's better at what, like just normal rebounding. But based off of this, PG-13 appears to be more efficient and a better scorer, while Jimmy Butler is a better all-around player. And something that I noticed was the assist to turnover ratio for the two. Butler being 5.5, so basically 6 to 2.1 to 2, and Paul George was 3.2 to 2.9. So basically, if you're rounding, it's 3 to 3. So for every 3 turnovers he gets 3 assists, which is it's not even it's really terrible. And that shows a huge gap in their playmaking. So when players like Jimmy Butler and Paul George are being compared, they're very similar. They're so similar that a normal statistics can't really break down who's the better player. So we're going to look at the advanced statistics. And for their offensive rating, Paul George is a 109 or a 109, while Jimmy Butler is a 123. Their defensive rating, Paul George is winning with a 108, and Jimmy Butler has a 106, so not that far behind. For their player efficiency rating, Jimmy Butler is a 25.1, while Paul George is a 20.2. For their true shooting percentage, they're identical at 58.6. For their rebounding percentage, Paul George has a higher rebounding percentage than Jimmy Butler at 10.3, while Jimmy is just 9 flat. Their assist percentage, Jimmy Butler is 24.8%, while Paul George is 16.1%. And then for their usage ratings, Jimmy Butler is a 26.5, which is almost a 27 if you're rounding. And then Paul George is a 28.9, which is basically a 29. For their win shares, Jimmy Butler is 13.8, almost 14, and Paul George is 7.1. And then for the offensive win shares, Jimmy Butler is 10.1, while Paul George is 4. For their defensive win shares, Jimmy Butler 3.8, while Paul George is 3.1. And for their box plus or minus, Jimmy Butler is blowing him out with a 6.9, which is a 7, and Paul George has a 2.8, which is basically a 3. And then for their offensive box plus or minus, Paul George has a 3.1, while Jimmy Butler has a 5.8, so he's killing him there too. And then for their defensive box plus or minus, Paul George is negative 0.3 and Jimmy Butler is 1.1, and I found that kind of interesting because that means that the team kind of gets worse on defense when Paul George is on the floor. But then for their value over replacement, which is kind of team oriented based on who was backing them up, but Paul George had a 3.2 while Jimmy Butler had a 6.3. So looking at these advanced statistics, Jimmy G Bucket starts to pull away, and this is the value advanced stats gives us, because looking at the field goal, 3-point, and free throw percentage, you would think George was a little bit more efficient than than Jimmy Butler. When you look at the true shooting percentage, which values free throw attempts, free throw percentage, field goal percentage, and 3-point percentage all into one stat, they show you that they are exactly as efficient as one another. They just get it done in different ways. Then you see Paul George has an advantage in his rebounding percentage, which would show him to be a better rebounder, although 14% of his minutes were at the forward or power forward position, while Jimmy Butler was only at power forward for 2%. But I can't really blame Paul George for his versatility, even though he hasn't played shooting guard since 2014. PG-13 does have the edge in defensive rating, which is inexcusable, but Butler has a significantly higher offensive rating, assist percentage, offensive win shares, offensive box plus or minus, and value over replacement on a 3% less usage rating, which was kind of huge for me. Jimmy Butler also led his team to more wins, as you can see by the higher win shares, and although PG-13 has higher defensive rating, Butler is positive in defensive blocks plus or minus, while Paul George is negative, and Butler has the higher defensive win shares. Paul George is a better 3-point shooter, but 81.5 of his threes were assisted, while Jimmy's was significantly less at 63.7, so we can kill the narrative that Butler can't shoot. Now we reach the final statistical indicator on who is better, which is the quote-unquote clutch factor. PG-13 shot 1 for 5 within the last 30 seconds of the fourth quarter to either tie or take the lead, and Butler was 5 for 10, and none of his were assisted, so Jimmy is 50% in clutch situations while George is 20%. And his one make was assisted on, so I don't think Paul George is better than Jimmy Butler overall, but if you want a 3-point shooter, Paul George is your guy. Now let's take a quick look at the qualitative side of basketball. Paul George has routinely thrown his teammates under the bus last postseason, and was reported to tell teammates routinely that he was leaving for LA the first chance he got, which shows that he may not be the best leader or locker room presence, especially for a team who would have had to gone young like the Pacers would have. And then for Jimmy Butler, yes, him and Dwayne Wade had the problems in the beginning of the season with the roster surrounding them just not caring, but that was just them being good leaders and basically getting on them, where the team just didn't respond very well in my opinion. But make sure you leave a like, subscribe, comment, and next week we're gonna go Paul George versus Jimmy Butler again, but in the playoffs. I mean, the playoffs is really what matters. If you can get it done in the regular season to get there, it's the playoffs that really can show. It separates the men from the boys is basically what I'm trying to say. So, alright, I'm out.